Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, listener, buckle up, because today we are going deep on dictators.
That's right.
The ones who practically wrote the evil playbook, Hitler and Castro.
Yeah.
You might be thinking, wait a minute, those two? Really? How can you even compare them?
The common reaction.
And it's exactly why this deep dive is so fascinating. We're going beyond the basic stuff, looking at how they clawed their way to the top, how they made their powers stick, and the really chilling reality for the people living under their rule.
It's the question, that keeps historians up at night. How could something like that happen? And we're not just listing dates and names here. We're going deep on the why. What were the weaknesses they exploited? What were the power moves they made? And how in the world was their propaganda so terrifyingly effective?
Okay, so everyone listening, I want you to picture this. 1930s Germany. World War I, it's still a fresh wound for them, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The country's humiliated, the economy's in shambles, and then on the flip side, you have 1950s Cuba, basically America's playground at that time, but under this iron fist of a dictator.
Right.
So we've got two totally different places, two completely different moments in time, yet both of them end up with these regimes that honestly still kind of haunt us to this day.
It's all about vulnerability, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like you said, a wound, a crack in the foundation. Dictators, they're masters at finding that crack and then just prying it wide open. Let's start with Hitler, because Germany after World War I was just primed to be taken advantage of. Imagine that sting of defeat, and then the Treaty of Versailles essentially just comes and rubs salt in the wound.
Yeah, and that's where that whole stab in the back myth starts to take hold, right?
Absolutely.
The idea that Germany didn't actually lose on the battlefield, that they were betrayed by people on the inside.
Classic tactic. Classic. Find a scapegoat. And it works even better if it's a group that's already marginalized in some way, and then just pin all the blame on them. And the Nazis, they were masters of this. Liberals, politicians, Jews. Anyone who didn't fit their narrative, they were the enemy. I'm curious, knowing what you do about Germany back then, how believable do you find this myth?
It's easy to see how in that kind of climate, the fear, the resentment, how that kind of rhetoric would gain traction.
Oh, for sure.
But it wasn't all just about wounded pride, was it?
No.
I mean, the sources we're looking at, they paint this really stark picture of what was going on with the German economy at that time.
Oh, it was the perfect storm.
Yeah.
You had hyperinflation so bad that people were burning money for fuel because it was cheaper than buying wood.
Wow.
I mean, just imagine the level of desperation.
Yeah.
And then into all this chaos walks Hitler. And he's offering not just a scapegoat, which we've talked about, but a solution.
Right.
A way back to their former glory, a restoration of German pride?
It's scary how appealing that must have sounded to people who felt like they had lost everything.
Absolutely.
So they're drawn to his message, his charisma, this promise of a stronger Germany.
Yeah.
But Hitler's rise, I mean, this wasn't an overnight thing, was it?
No, not at all. In fact, he's appointed chancellor in 1933.
Right.
And it was a calculated risk by the conservative elite. They thought, we can use this guy, we can control him. Let's just say it didn't quite pan out the way they planned.
Talk about a miscalculation.
Oh, yeah.
But that's where you get that whole historical debate, right?
Exactly.
Did Hitler, I mean, did he orchestrate this entire thing from the beginning? Or was he just incredibly good at seizing the opportunity when he saw it?
$1 million question.
Yeah.
Were the Nazis this well-oiled machine with some master plan that had been in the works for years?
Right.
Or were they kind of making things up as they went along, exploiting each crisis to their advantage? And there's actually compelling evidence on both sides of that.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It is.
Okay, so let's shift gears over to Castro's Cuba.
Okay.
Because this one hits a little closer to home for us, right? We're talking 90 miles off the U.S. coastline. What was it about Cuba that made it the ripe breeding ground for a revolution?
Honestly, you can't overstate how important that proximity to the U.S. really was.
Right.
By the 1950s, Cuba was basically an American playground. U.S. businesses, they controlled massive chunks of the Cuban economy.
Yeah.
And the average Cuban citizen,
Yeah.
they saw very little of that wealth.
And that's where Batista enters the picture.
Yes.
Right. And our sources describe his regime as being full of corruption, brutality, and a lot of support from the U.S.
Exactly. As long as the money kept flowing to American corporations, Batista could pretty much do whatever he wanted.
Wow.
And naturally, this bred resentment,
Yeah.
this yearning for change, for something different.
Right.
And into that void steps Fidel Castro.
And here's a guy, I mean, this is a guy who could have lived a life of total luxury.
Right. Sort of.
Came from a wealthy family, he studied law. What radicalized him? What happened?
That's what's so fascinating about Castro's story, because he starts out on this very traditional path, but then something changes.
Yeah.
He sees the poverty, he sees the corruption, the inequality in his own country.
Yeah.
And by 1953, he's leading this armed attack on the Moncada barracks.
Right.
Now it fails,
Yeah.
but that's where the legend of Fidel Castro really begins.
Right. Even in defeat, he gives that famous "history will absolve me" speech, which instantly turns him into this symbol of resistance.
Absolutely.
So unlike Hitler, who rises to power through this broken political system, Castro chooses armed revolution. Was that strategic?
Yeah.
Or was he really that idealistic about it all?
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Was it just a brilliant move against an opponent he knew was already weak?
Right.
Or was Castro driven by this anger, this outrage at how Cubans were being treated? And maybe even more importantly, was Castro a homegrown phenomenon, or was he, maybe even unknowingly, a pawn in this much bigger Cold War chess game between the U.S. and the Soviet Union?
It's fascinating how with these two guys, I mean, wildly different situations, they were both able to tap into this existing frustration and position themselves as the solution.
That's incredible.
But getting their foot in the door,
Yeah.
I mean, that was just the first step, right?
Oh, yeah. The real test is what you do once you actually have the power.
Right.
And that's where things get really chilling, because both of these men, they were masters at consolidating their control.
So they've ridden this wave of discontent. They've seized power. Now what?
Right, because it's like they say getting to the top is one thing. Staying there, that's a whole different ball game.
Totally.
And both Hitler and Castro, they were absolutely ruthless when it came to consolidating their power. It's like this really dark reminder that revolutions, even the ones that are promising freedom and liberation,
Right.
they can easily morph into something equally oppressive.
Oh, absolutely. And the street at which it happens, right? It's
Oh, yeah.
like 1 minute it's protest rallies and the next minute, bam, totalitarianism.
Yeah.
Take Hitler, for example. Our sources all point to the Reichstag fire in 1933 as this major turning point. You know, that whole never let a good crisis go to waste thing.
Right.
So for our listeners who might not remember, what exactly happened there?
Okay, so the Reichstag, the German parliament building, it goes up in flames.
Right.
Now, the Nazis, they immediately blame the communists.
Right.
But
That's what
a
happened.
lot of historians today believe that it was an inside job, a way for Hitler to grab even more power.
And what did he do? Declare martial law or something?
Basically, he issues the Reichstag fire decree, which, I mean, you're talking about hitting fast forward on authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Civil liberties, gone. Freedom of the press, nope.
Wow.
The decree let them arrest and detain anyone indefinitely and without a trial if they were seen as an enemy of the state.
Right.
And that could be anyone who disagreed with the Nazis, even a little.
It's crazy how fragile those democratic institutions can be when you've got that kind of pressure. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
But he didn't stop there, did he? Then you've got the Night of the Long Knives, which I gotta say still gives me the chills.
And with good reason. 1934, Hitler and the SS, his own elite guard, they go on this rampage, purging anyone they see as a threat. And I'm not just talking rivals, we're talking former allies, even people within his own Nazi party.
Wait, he killed his own people?
Oh, yeah.
That is cold, even for a dictator. Why, though? What was the point of targeting the SA, his own paramilitary group?
Control. It always comes back to control. The SA, you know, the brown shirts.
Yeah.
They'd gotten too big, too powerful. And honestly, too independent for Hitler's liking. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, he'd even been talking about a second revolution.
Oh, I bet that went over well.
Not so much. The Night of the Long Knives, it wasn't just a purge, it was a message, a very bloody message
Right.
that Hitler was the one in charge. And if you even thought about disagreeing with him,
Yeah.
well, you were going to meet a very grisly end.
It's a good thing nobody ever told Hitler to keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, because he seemed to just wipe out anyone who even looked at him sideways.
Right.
But then you have this whole historical debate about how organized the Nazi regime actually was. I mean, how does that work if he's staging these calculated power grabs like we've been talking about?
See, that's the thing about history. It rarely fits neatly into these little boxes we try to put it in.
Right.
Because on the surface, you look at the Nazi state and you see this terrifyingly efficient machine, right?
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways it was.
Mm-hmm.
But there are historians who argue that behind the scenes
Yeah.
it was chaos. With all these different factions within the Nazi Party, all fighting for power, fighting for Hitler's ear.
So more like a viper's nest than a well-oiled machine.
Exactly.
Which honestly might be even more terrifying.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you never knew who was really in control.
Exactly. Was Hitler actually the one calling the shots? Or was he at times being manipulated by the people around him? It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It is. So, okay, we've got Hitler over here consolidating his power through brute force and manipulation.
Right.
Meanwhile, in Cuba, Castro's path takes a slightly different turn.
Yeah.
He's just overthrown a dictator who is practically being propped up by the U.S.
Right.
So what were his first moves to secure his own regime?
Castro knew he had to act fast, he had to be decisive. He also understood the power of that whole symbolic break from the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first things he does is nationalize all these key industries,
Right.
a lot of which were, you guessed it, controlled by American companies.
Talk about making a statement.
Oh, yeah.
That must have gone over so well in Washington.
Let's just say it didn't exactly get a standing ovation. The U.S. was already pretty nervous about communist influence so close to home.
Right, their own backyard.
Exactly. So when Castro basically kicked them to the curb,
Yeah.
well, let's just say it tapped into all those Cold War anxieties about the spread of communism.
Which probably played right into Castro's hands.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of playing into Castro's hands, can we talk about the Bay of Pigs invasion?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's almost comical how badly that backfired on the U.S.
It's like a textbook example of what not to do.
Right. Just in case you need a refresher.
Yeah.
1961, the CIA, they get the green light from Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
They train this group of Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro.
Right.
And the whole thing was a disaster from the get-go.
Yeah.
The invasion force was a mess. There was zero element of surprise.
Mm-hmm.
And Castro's military, they were ready.
They were waiting.
Oh, yeah. And this is where Castro's propaganda machine really kicks into gear.
Right.
He takes this humiliating defeat for the U.S. and spins it into this glorious victory for the Cuban people.
A complete propaganda coup.
Oh, absolutely. The Bay of Pigs, it became this rallying cry, this symbol of Cuban resistance against the big bad U.S.
Right.
It solidified Castro's power, and it pushed Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union.
Wow.
I mean, it's incredible how one side's mistake can become the other side's propaganda goldmine.
It's all about how you spin it, right?
Exactly.
But even with the U.S. out of the picture, at least officially,
Right.
Castro still had to worry about dissent from within Cuba.
Oh, for sure.
How did he maintain control on his home turf? What was everyday life actually like under his rule?
This is where things get interesting. So on the one hand, Castro, he was not afraid to silence anyone who spoke out against him.
Mm-hmm.
He established the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution,
Okay.
CDRs for short, which were basically, or at least on paper, neighborhood watch groups.
Okay, I was going to say neighborhood watch groups sounds a little too, I don't know, wholesome for dictatorship.
Yeah, well, these had a much darker side.
What do they actually do?
Think of them like the eyes and ears of the revolution,
right.
way more sinister.
Right.
CDRs were everywhere. Workplaces, apartment buildings, literally on every block. They were encouraged to report anything suspicious.
Which, under a dictatorship, could basically mean anything, right?
Pretty much. Any criticism of the government, unauthorized gatherings, even listening to the wrong music.
So it wasn't just the secret police people had to worry about. It was their neighbors,
Yep,
their co-workers, maybe even their own families.
that's right.
Talk about a chilling effect on free speech.
Absolutely. But it wasn't all just fear and intimidation. Castro also knew that to stay in power,
Yeah.
you got to keep the people at least somewhat happy.
Right, you could just rely on fear all the time.
Exactly. So alongside the repression, there was a real push to improve the lives of everyday Cubans.
So it's a classic mix of carrot and stick, crush any opposition, but also give people things like healthcare and education to build support.
Exactly. And those social programs, they were incredibly popular.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Castro's government actually made huge strides in healthcare and education. Literacy rates, they went way up. And Cuba became known for having one of the best healthcare systems in Latin America.
So is all that genuine? Or was it just Castro being really good at playing the political game?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Castro was a master at balancing the repression with just enough progress to make things look legit.
Right.
He understood that if you want real, lasting power,
Yeah.
You need to at least look like you have the support of the people.
It's fascinating how these dictators could be so ruthless, but then at the same time,
Yeah.
they could turn around and put these policies in place that actually help people.
It's a strange dichotomy, isn't it?
It is, but one thing both Hitler and Castro understood
Yeah.
was the power of a good story.
Oh, absolutely.
They were masters at controlling the narrative, shaping how people thought about their regimes.
And that brings us to probably their most effective and insidious tool of control, propaganda.
Right.
Because it's not enough to just silence the people who disagree with you. You have to replace their voices with your own narrative.
Right.
One that justifies your actions, one that paints your enemies as the bad guys, and ultimately one that keeps you firmly in power.
It really is wild how important the story is.
Oh, it's everything. You control the story, you control the people, and nobody understood that better than these two, Hitler and Castro.
Yeah, and with Hitler, I mean, you can't talk about propaganda without talking about the Holocaust.
Right.
But what our sources point out is that Nazi ideology, I mean, it went way beyond just racial hatred.
Oh, yeah.
It was deeply tied to this whole idea of national renewal. Like Germany was going to rise from the ashes, return to some like mythical golden age.
It was a powerful message, this
Yeah.
vision of a purified Germany, right? All of the enemies purged, the country restored to its former glory.
Right, but then who are those enemies exactly?
Well, anyone who didn't fit their very, very narrow idea of Aryan perfection,
It's scary how easily people buy into that kind of us versus them thinking.
especially when you have someone like Goebbels pulling the strings.
Right. The infamous propaganda minister.
This guy was a master at manipulating people's emotions.
Yeah, it's chilling when you think about it.
He knew that propaganda wasn't just about repeating lies over and over again. It was
Yeah.
about creating this whole alternate reality.
And the Nazis, they were masters of spectacle, right?
right. So
Those huge rallies, the torchlight parades.
you can't underestimate the power of that kind of immersive experience.
Yeah, it just drowns out any other voices, any other perspectives.
Exactly. They even had, get this, a special film truck, right? It could literally drive into these tiny villages and show propaganda films.
Wow. Talk about taking your message on the road.
Right. They were relentless.
It makes you wonder, though, was the Holocaust, I mean, was that always part of the plan?
That's the question, isn't it? Historians are still debating that today.
Because on the one hand, you have Hitler's own words, right? There's no question about his hatred for Jewish people.
No question at all.
But then you also have to remember the chaotic nature of the Nazi regime.
It's true, a lot of decisions were made on the fly.
Driven by whatever was happening at that moment.
Exactly, by this constant need to escalate the violence.
So was the Holocaust a carefully planned genocide? Or was it like this horrifying byproduct of a system that had spiraled totally out of control?
It's a terrifying thought, and there's evidence to support both sides.
It really makes you think about the dangers of ideology.
No, absolutely.
No matter how appealing it might seem at first, things can get out of hand so quickly.
And it's not like this is just ancient history. Those same dangers exist today.
Oh, absolutely. And Castro's propaganda machine, I mean, it might not have been based on the same kind of racial hatred,
Right.
but it was just as effective in controlling how people thought.
Oh, 100%. And his big rallying cry was anti-imperialism.
Which, let's be real, that's a message that still resonates with a lot of people today.
All over the world.
Yeah, the idea of this small nation standing up to this global superpower,
Right.
it's classic David and Goliath.
Exactly. Castro was brilliant at positioning himself as the champion of the oppressed.
Right.
The defender of Cuban sovereignty, standing strong against the big bad U.S.
And he was really good at using humor, too,
Oh, yeah. He loved to poke fun at his enemies.
especially the U.S.
He knew that satire could be just as effective as any weapon.
It's interesting, though, how Castro managed to maintain this image as, like, a revolutionary hero.
Right.
But then at the same time, he was incredibly repressive.
Oh, absolutely.
It wasn't all just slogans and speeches, though. I mean, Castro actually delivered on some of his promises.
He did, especially when it came to things like healthcare and education.
Right, and our sources talk about his literacy campaigns, universal health care. How much of that was genuine, do you think? And how much of it was just a way to keep the Cuban people on his side?
$1 million question. Castro was a master at balancing those two sides, you know?
Yeah.
He'd crack down on dissent, but then he'd also give people these very real benefits.
Right.
He knew that sometimes you got to sweeten the deal a little bit if you want people to stay quiet.
It's a classic strategy.
Oldest trick in the book.
Wow, okay, so we've covered a lot today. Two very different paths to power. Very different.
Two very different propaganda playbooks, but both of them, both Hitler and Castro, created these regimes built on control and oppression.
And fear.
It's a chilling reminder of how fragile freedom really is.
It is, and that even when it looks like things are getting better, it can all change in an instant.
It's a lot to think about.
It is, but that's the point, isn't it? We have to stay vigilant, we have to question everything, and we can't be afraid to hold our leaders accountable.
Because the fight for freedom, it never really ends, does it?
It's a fight that every generation has to be prepared to fight.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.